Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll find out why the Department of Justice continues to fail when it comes to protecting American consumers. They have very good reasons. Scott Walker, well, he's found himself at the center of a criminal probe, and we'll tell you why this scandal could finally take down the Tea Party hero, Scott Walker. And Congress recently made our roadways a lot more dangerous. We'll give you all the details. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, remember, you just stepped in to the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
All due respect, John, I was a strong supporter then of going into Iraq. I'm a strong supporter now. Everybody knows what my position is. But if we spend our time debating what happened 11 or 12 years ago, we're going to miss the threat that is growing and that we do face.
Dick Cheney's been making talk show rounds recently telling us that Obama's failing the American public by not launching into Iraq one more time to kill more people at a huge cost. This is the man who told us that the first Iraq war would be over in about 100 days. Remember that? Joining me now to tell the ugly story of Dick Cheney's warmongering is Farron Cousins, executive editor of the Trial Lawyer magazine. Farron, another Sunday of Sunday war shows. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. You have a corporate media that just is itching to get us back into Iraq because they made so damn much money off the last war. So what do? They put in people like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, all the war pimps. I mean, Rumsfeld, you name it. The war pimps are out in full tilt, and organizations like ABC are making sure that they just let them pitch this war again. Do you see it differently?
Oh, absolutely not. And I think what's remarkable about it is that by the time all of these people left office, there was a general consensus among both conservatives and liberals that these guys lied us into a war, killed thousands of U.S. troops, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, and they were basically the political pariahs of America. But now all of a sudden we get turmoil in Iraq, and instead of being labeled as criminals, they're labeled as experts. We bring on Dick Cheney because he's an expert in security. He's an expert in Iraq, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, let me talk about that expert just for a minute. This is the expert that made speeches all over the media, tons of speeches, where he said, A, the war is going to be a 100-day war. B, I know personally that there are weapons of mass destruction. He took it on himself to say, almost like sworn affidavit, yeah, I know that personally there are weapons of mass destruction. C, that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11. So rather than the media asking any serious questions, they let this buffoon, who was nothing more than a war pimp, interestingly enough, a war pimp who has never been to war himself because he did everything he could to avoid the draft in Nam. But they just let him go. We're seeing that same thing again, aren't we?
We are. And you know what else they're letting go? A huge, huge, huge part of the story. You know, think back about 13 years ago to those secret energy task force meetings that Dick Cheney was holding with Halliburton, Exxon, Chevron, all the major players from the oil industry. We don't know very much about what happened in those meetings, but what we do know is that they had a map of Iraq drawn out. And each little individual spot was cut up, and they said, this part, Exxon, this is your part of Iraq. Halliburton, this is yours. Everybody had their own little piece of the Iraq pie, and nobody talked about it back then, hardly ever, other than, you know, the few progressive hosts that were out there. But nobody's bringing that up today. When they get Dick Cheney on the show, say, can you take us back? Can you tell us what happened in those meetings? Which part of Iraq went to Halliburton? Which part went to Exxon? Nobody wants to ask him those tough questions, and it's very sad that one of the toughest interviews Dick Cheney has had actually came from Megyn Kelly at Fox News.
And I really wouldn't call that a tough interview at all, but you're right. She's the only one. I mean, Gregory, forget it. I mean, you know, Gregory, it sounds like he is on he's part of the team. Yeah, let's go do this again. Let's kill another 4,500 U.S. soldiers. Let's kill another 650 Iraqi civilians. Let's spend another $4 trillion because this is what this has cost us. And nobody is asking this character, who should be a war criminal, Dick Cheney, should be calibrated as a war criminal. And you know what the problem is? The sitting president, Mr. Obama, decided, hey, we're just not going to look back. Remember his speech, let's look ahead?
Right.
This issue that you're talking about, though, we know quite a lot about because our law partner actually asked for freedom of information request. He made freedom of information request asking for that material. The U.S. Supreme Court stopped it. Actually, Scalia stopped it. He said, no, you can't have that material. And he said that 1 week after he went duck hunting with Dick Cheney. Now, why is it so important? Because this map that you're talking about, we know exists, and so Dick Cheney is continuing to deliver after he was paid $35 million from Halliburton. Don't miss that. That was just the beginning. That's only $35 million. That's just the surface. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And so, go ahead.
Well, Dick Cheney is still the oil industry's boy. He always has been, and he always will be. He may not have a lot of time left on Earth, but he is damn sure going to spend that time making sure that his friends at Halliburton, who made him a multimillionaire, get their payday. Because it never really came from the first Iraq War. They went in, they made such a mess that nobody could really do anything. Yeah, they did make a lot of money off it, but not as much money as they had thought. And when Obama came in, eventually pulled troops out, as expected, the whole place kind of descended into chaos like we're seeing now. But the bigger part of that story is that we knew no matter what, no matter how long we stayed in Iraq, it was going to descend into chaos. We had every single military expert telling us even before our invasion that if you go in there, it is unsustainable. You will have to be there forever. Our torture policies helped bolster al-Qaeda. Study after study proves that. We created this mess, and now there's not much we can do.
Farron, you remember the generals when they were critical of, they said, first of all, they laughed at the idea of Dick Cheney's 100-day war. They said, how pathetically stupid. Now, those generals were discredited, but what did they say? Let's think back what they said. They said, first of all, we're not really sure there's weapons of mass destruction. They said, we know that Saddam Hussein is not connected to 9/11. They were telling the truth. The other thing that I think is most important is they said the sectarian violence is going to escalate if we do this. Sectarian violence between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And they called it exactly. They said there's no way that you're going to go in and ever leave Iraq. If you go in there, you are there forever. This is not a North Korea, South Korea kind of scenario at all. That was what they were trying to sell. Well, at least we can stabilize it. The general said impossible because you have Iran involved, you have Syria involved, you have Afghanistan involved, and you know what? The real problem is you got China involved. And so what you have is this sectarian conflict that the general said is never going to go away.
Right, and you can go back through those news stories dating all the way back to 2002 and read every single warning that they gave us. And now you compare that to what's happening today. Everything they predicted came true. And it all relates back to the policies of Dick Cheney. I mean, you can't even call it the Bush presidency. It was the Dick Cheney presidency. He is the one who wanted this. He was the one involved with the Project for a New American Century. And I guess that new American century is a century of war, because that is what Cheney wants. That is what Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush.
The Jeb Bush story that we're going to talk about on this show. Look, the truth is, this is as much a media story. This is a media war. Don't you remember Wolf Blitzer with his big maps on the floor and holograms? We're going to move in here today, and we've got embedded journalists that they're going to tell about this glorious war, and it's going to be over with. You remember that? It was like we were selling, may as well sold popcorn with it, as if we were going to go in there and get out. Later, 4,500 dead U.S. soldiers, 45,000 crippled with brain damage, amputations, paralysis, and disabilities that changes their life forever. And you have this war pimp this coward of a vice president, ex-vice president, Dick Cheney, talking about the glory of it, and there's no question, just because of this point that you made, there's no question, it all relates to those promises that he made to the Halliburtons and the Exxons and the Shells before the first round took place.
Well, and you go back and look at how the media is promoting it. Like, oh gosh, we've got Dick Cheney coming on our show today to talk about Iraq. You don't want to miss it. You know, they're going to social media and they're talking about it like, you got to hear what Dick Cheney is going to say. Dick Cheney's got some great insight into this. And nobody ever wants to just say like, this man lied. There are thousands of families out there who no longer have fathers or mothers or sons or daughters because of Dick Cheney.
Yeah,
Nobody
and let me
wants
just
to
tell
say
you,
that.
let me tell you this. Dick Cheney's new talking point, you followed this one, the new Republican talking point is ignore how we lied to you last time. We have to pay attention to this. Ignore it. It doesn't mean anything. We lied to you. It was a disaster, but ignore all that because now this is more important.
That is almost exactly what he said on ABC News this week. And he said, forget what happened in Iraq before because that doesn't matter anymore. The only thing that matters is what Obama is not doing in Iraq today. He told us to just forget about those 8 years of endless war that he wanted where it was a complete failure.
Yeah, if we would have had some real congressional hearings on Dick Cheney's lies and Wolfowitz's lies and Judith Miller and Paul Pillar, I mean, if we'd have just had some truth here, maybe we wouldn't even be having these Sunday talk shows, having to endure Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney, war pimps, talking about another war that they would never participate in. Thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you.
The Department of Justice has become so dysfunctional that they aren't even capable of prosecuting a crime when they have more than enough evidence. This is what's happened with Wall Street bankers. We know the crimes, we have the evidence, but the Department of Justice has done nothing because they've been directed to do nothing. Joining me now to explain that is Mike Burg. Mike, important investigation coming out of the Inspector General's office where they basically have to fall on their sword and say the FBI, the Justice Department, the FBI, everybody involved with trying to make sure that the Wall Street bankers don't get away with everything. These were the people that were supposed to be prosecuting the Wall Street bankers. The report says, if you read it and understand it, what a dismal disaster. Nobody goes to jail.
Well, first of all, no surprise for me that all this has come out because, as you know, we've been talking about it for probably 2-3 years that the Department of Justice, the FBI, really has had no interest in going after the big banks and the fraud they're committing on consumers. And it starts with the Obama administration. You and I know, and we've talked about it, is that their ties to these big law firms who represent these big banks, as well as their ties to the big banks, makes this no surprise at all. When Williams and Connolly, who defends all the white-collar criminals, who, and all of them, if you go to Wall Street, you go to all the big-time criminals who are in politics, Williams and Connolly is number one on the list when they're so close to the Obama administration that they're vetting and giving recommendations on federal judges and circuit court judges. There's no surprise that this administration and the Department of Justice has no interest in going after the biggest criminals in the United States.
What's so and by the way, not just Williams and Connolly, Covington Burling, which is where our Attorney General Eric Holder comes from. He knows he has a job. Lanny Brewer, you recall, Lanny Brewer is the guy that had to resign from the Department of Justice because they started asking him questions, why haven't you prosecuted anybody? Then you find out that Lanny Brewer, also with Covington Burling, actually represents Wall Street. Then the person who replaced Lanny Brewer, it goes on and on. The woman who replaced Lanny Brewer just resigned. They asked her, well, why didn't you prosecute anybody on Wall Street? Why didn't you get the FBI involved in going after Wall Street? Come to find out, she resigns. She goes to work with Covington Burling. So there's look, this is a report that came directly from the Inspector General's office. And I think what's so agonizing about the report is even when they were telling the story, they tried to cover up the fact that where it came to serious kinds of prosecution, none really took place. One banker, I'm not making this up. People listening to this going to think we're making this up. One banker that was involved with Goldman Sachs went to jail for something completely unrelated to all the fraud that burned down our economy. So, I mean, what's happening here, Mike? What is it that we can do about it if you have a Department of Justice and an FBI that intentionally is letting these bankers off the hook?
Well, I can tell you, and just to add one thing, firsthand, we know, as you know, we were the first to follow and to file a case on the CDO collapse, the $7 trillion collapse. We still don't have a ruling. It's been going on since 2007. The politics that are being played, we had our judge removed. Our judge gave us a great order. He was sent to domestic relations. They put another judge in there. This judge has held the case for 3 years, and we have gone nowhere to go forward to really tell the truth of what happened in the collapse. So what can the public do?
And Mike, tell the politics of that judge. It's important to know where that judge came from, where that judge's ties are.
Yeah, let me tell you, the first judge we had in the state court of Connecticut was someone who had worked in the white collar crime division, both at DOJ and also at the Attorney General's office. He got it. He understood what was going on. He made them, in one case, post a $50 million bond because of the likelihood that we were going to win. He issued an order that was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal in which he talked about what was going on with UBS and the rating agencies. And within 6 months, he was sent to domestic relations by the Supreme Court of the state of Connecticut. And we got another judge put in there who has done nothing but overrule him, hold the case, dismiss it on absolutely no basis for standing, gave us a rehearing, and we still don't have an order. We're in 2014. The case has been going on for 7 years, and it's because the politicians, in this case, the governor, who used to be the mayor of Stanford, is now the governor. He has close ties to UBS, and it's also the federal government not willing to do anything. So we're all trapped.
And let's not dance around this. This comes directly from President Obama. There is zero question that if President Obama really wanted to do what he promised he was going to do. You remember he was running. He said, I'm going to clean up Wall Street. Yes, they've stolen $13 trillion away from the American public. They have ruined mom-and-pop pension programs. They've foreclosed on 5 million people that have lost their homes because of this disaster that was absolutely nothing more than a criminal scam. So he comes into office, he runs for office as if this really matters to him, as if he really takes this seriously. And now this report comes out and says this. Now, nobody took it seriously. Mike, let me ask you this. When you look at this report, it looks like the way they got around the problem of having to do anything to Wall Street bankers was to redefine what mortgage fraud was. Redefine what fraud was. Isn't that what happened here? They said, we're going to define the things we have to go after in such a way that we can justify not going after Wall Street. That's what the FBI did, that's what the Department of Justice did, and that's what the Inspector General's office did. Did I get that right?
You did, but it's even worse than that, in my opinion. It's like the guy, the magician, who makes you look over one way at a shiny object while he's pulling a trick out from under the table. That's what they're doing here. They're going after people like the one guy or somebody in the hinterland who did one little thing, this kind of inside trading where somebody made $1 million, and they're saying, see, we're going after somebody, when in fact, the $6 to $7 trillion that was stolen, they don't want you to look over there. It's sort of the Wizard of Oz. They don't look at the man behind the curtain. Look over at all this smoke and mirrors that we're throwing up. And that's what they're doing here. They're throwing up smoke and mirrors. What makes me crazy, and you know how crazy I get about all this stuff, is the poor guy who has no money, who's making minimum wage and can't feed his sick baby. He may go out and he may commit a crime and go forward 7-Eleven, he's going to prison. But these guys who conspired and ruthlessly committed misrepresentation and fraud, and the list of crimes that these banks have done is endless.
Oh, let's relive a couple of them. How about this? How about laundering money for the drug cartel? How about laundering money for terrorism? How about engaging in something where you know that what you're selling to your stockholders, you're selling to a guy on the street wants to buy shares of stock. You lie to him about the fact that this stock that you're selling actually has anything to back it up. That's how bad this fraud. How about this? Robo-signing, where where you actually have you have a machine that simply signs documents that absolutely falsify payments made before a house is foreclosed, who owns the paper on the house, who owns the title and the deed on the house, falsified. They caught them red-handed, and nobody goes to jail.
Right, and even beyond that, we got hiding money for tax cheats overseas. They caught the Swiss banks. There's been no prosecution of UBS over that, none at all. Even when they are going after the banks, this is what's laughable. When they're going after them for civil fines, all they're doing is getting back billions. We lent them the billions of dollars during the collapse, but the poor people who lost their houses because of this fraud get no compensation. Pension funds, civil actions that are being brought, like the one we brought for a hedge fund that lost $100 million on what was complete fraud. The people and their investors, they get zero.
Being dismissed because the federal government is wanting this to happen. Right now, let me tell you, Democrats, just as bad as Republicans. Fortunately, you have Elizabeth Warren, you have Elijah Cummings, you have Maxine Waters are saying, damn it, we want some answers on this. We want some congressional hearings. Obama, Holder, you have held them up. You've prevented these congressional hearings. We want them now. So I think this story is going to continue to gel. We're going to follow it, okay? Thank you for joining me, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Scott Walker survived his recall election a few years ago, but new evidence has emerged that says he may have won the re-election only because he broke a lot of campaign laws. If that's the case, he can kiss his political career goodbye. He should be prosecuted. Joining me to talk about what's happening with Walker is Ruth Conniff, editor of the Progressive magazine. You know, Ruth, sometimes you just can't change corrupt DNA, and I think that's what we have happening with Scott Walker. God, every time I think of what y'all have to go up there, what you have to endure up there with Scott Walker, it's almost implausible, isn't it?
It is amazing, but I have to tell you, once again, it has national implications. You know, it's not just Wisconsin. This is a national news story because this latest news about Walker is really the effort of the right-wing network nationwide to do away once and for all with all campaign finance regulation.
Yeah, to put this in a nutshell, let me run through, just see if I have these facts right. You have this, I call it the distribution entity, which is Wisconsin Club for Growth. Day one, they have no money. Day two, they have tens and tens of millions of dollars. They then take that money and they then distribute to 501c4s. The importance being is those 501c4s have had to sign affidavits in order to get their 501c4 entity saying that they would not support political candidates. So all of a sudden we find that at work here, the Scott Walker's own people is coordinating this money with 501c4s, which clearly, as the prosecutor in this case determined, is illegal. It's a crime. Yeah. Take it from there if I got that right.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening here in Wisconsin is that, as the prosecutor put it, and he is a Republican, even though Scott Walker has been on TV a lot lately saying that this is a partisan witch hunt, and it was a Democratic district attorney who is responsible for this investigation of Walker and his associates, it is actually a Republican who's the lead prosecutor in this case, Fran Schmitz. He was shortlisted, by the way, to be a federal prosecutor by George W. Bush, and he's put out a statement today defending his integrity against these attacks by Walker, saying, you know, I served in the U.S. military, and I am, you know, basically asserting his conservative bona fides. In this new set of documents that came out on Thursday from the federal court, the Club for Growth was making the argument that this whole thing needs to stop, and they're making this argument based on a very aggressive ideological position equals speech, and that any regulation of campaign finance, including Wisconsin's century-old law saying that you cannot coordinate with outside groups that pour money into a campaign, run their own ads, and coordinate with that campaign, saying that that's a violation of their free speech rights, and therefore this whole thing should be off. That has huge national implications. Actually, it may go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Well, that's what they're counting on, don't you think, Ruth? They're setting up the playbook, just like they did with Citizens United, just like they did with McCutcheon. You set the playbook up, and that's what they're doing methodically, to where if anybody is actually indicted and convicted, they have this in play all the way to the Supreme Court. Isn't part of the problem here, Ruth, that you have one thing that we've always understood: we don't want foreign countries influencing our elections. We don't want cartel money moving into an election cycle, or what they call conflict money. That is, where the money going to the candidate, that there's a clear conflict between that candidate and where the money's coming from. So there are disclosure necessities. Now, this Supreme Court has tried to make it sound like there are no bounds. And Scott Walker, in this criminal enterprise, you don't have to call it that. I'll call it that. I'm an attorney. I used to be a prosecutor. I understand what a criminal enterprise looks like. This is a criminal enterprise. And so the pushback is simply that we have a First Amendment right to do this? Is that kind of it?
Well, there's two kinds of pushback. This is going through the courts. The first thing that happened, Walker is trying to say this is all over. The case is closed. It's wrapped up with nothing. And that's because the Club for Growth and the other right-wing entities involved in this illegal coordination, what Fran Schmitz, the Republican prosecutor in the case, actually said was a criminal scheme that Walker himself is at the center of. That's based partly on an email that came out from Scott Walker to Karl Rove, basically outlining this whole statewide network and saying his chief campaign advisor, R.J. Johnson, was in charge of it. So they have gone to court to try to suppress it, to try to get it thrown out. And they found a federal judge, Judge Rudolph Randa, who is a member of the Federalist Society and a frequent flyer to Koch brothers finance.
And a Republican-appointed judge. Bush won, yeah.
I mean, a real right-wing ideologue. He not only said that the investigation should halt, he ordered the prosecutors to destroy all of the evidence. That was immediately reversed by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And because it was, and all that evidence wasn't destroyed, this email showing Walker, in fact, at the center of this, came to light. And that is a huge problem for Scott Walker, because this is the first thing that actually connects him directly to what the prosecutor calls a criminal scheme.
I read some of what Rudolph Randa wrote. First of all, there are no surprises about the guy. The guy is a politician, a thug politician from the standpoint of his politics, a Republican politician dressed up in a black robe. I mean, the only distinction is he has a black robe on. Now, this is a judge who, at the end of all this, has said, you know what? We can't do anything about it. He said that they had a clever loophole. Did you see that wording? He calls it a clever loophole, and because these criminals are so clever, I have to let them go because speech equals money without exception. This is a case with huge national implications, isn't it, when we see that the inheritance billionaires are trying to do the same type of thing all over, right here in Florida with Rick Scott.
Absolutely. And I think what's happened is they tried to stop it. They tried to suppress it. They tried to destroy evidence to keep it from coming to light. Then Walker himself tried to reach a deal with prosecutors reportedly. And the Wall Street Journal, in an unprecedented move, wrote an editorial basically warning Walker, don't forget who you work for. Do not strike a deal with prosecutors that hands over these right-wing money groups that could, disadvantage them. So they've either tried to this all together, this clear violation of state law in Wisconsin, or once the evidence is out there and it seems harder to suppress, and it is on appeal currently, they are really trying to take it to the hoop with this argument, as you talked about, that all money is speech, that there should be no regulation whatsoever, that Wisconsin and other states should have no ability to regulate with disclosure rules or with limits on contributions to campaigns and their coordination with these outside groups like Karl Rove, like the Koch brothers, who've come into our state in such a big way. Even in little school board races now, we see the Koch brothers pouring in money.
Ruth, that's what people don't understand. They think the money has to do with the White House and Senate and congressional races. All over the country, the reports that we're getting, and we've interviewed a number of people, that say, look, it's county commissioners. Why is it, for example, why is it county commissioners in a place like Ohio? Because the Koch brothers want to frack in Ohio, and you have to have permission and you have to have cooperation from the commissioners. Why is it that they're going after the city councilmen in places like Florida? Because they want to drill offshore, and they don't want any of the politicians objecting to what's going on offshore. So what we see this happening from top to bottom. They've got a lot of money to spread around. $25 million they gave to the NAACP, and now we see that the president of the NAACP made a private meeting in California this past week to meet with 300 billionaires and the Koch brothers so they could explain to the NAACP what their marching orders are. The money is just overwhelming our system, isn't it?
It is overwhelming, and this was the first year that we saw it come into a local school board race in Kenosha. The Koch brothers came in big. This is a continuation of the fight that you came and saw here against Act 10, the decertification of the unions, for the teachers' unions. That school board had reached a contract agreement with the teachers in that area, so the Koch brothers came in with big money, and as one of our writers put it, basically bought a lemonade stand with their credit card, flipped the board, entirely ideological right-wing board now. They came up into Iron County to a tiny little board race. One of the candidates there, his whole campaign war chest was a roll of stamps, and they brought out their slick flyers and their robocalls, and they did their best to take over that board because there's a huge controversial mining project that board's going to make a zoning decision on. So this is what money from outside the state means in politics here, and this is why this is such an important fight.
Well, I got to tell you, if you look at what happened here with these 501c4s, again, if you're running a 501c4 and you signed the affidavit that you would not be involved directly with a candidate like Scott Walker, and you are involved with that candidate, or you were involved with that candidate, I would be very, very concerned. Because this doesn't just have to do with Wisconsin. This has to do with what could be a national enterprise that all falls within RICO claims. So, I mean, if I'm a 501c4 owner and I lied on my affidavit when I said that this was going to be used for social and civic improvement, and instead I find out it's been used for Scott Walker's campaign, this is very, very serious business. So, I mean, do people seem to understand how serious this is with this distribution of money?
I think there's a lot of worry on the part of the targets of the investigation, and I think that's one of the reasons they're trying to talk about how it's prosecutorial overreach, and they're trying to stop it as quickly as they can. And I think that's why you see the national right-wing media coming in, the Wall Street Journal writing 2 different editorials telling Walker not to cut a deal to save himself, because the danger is very great.
Incredible.
But Walker's connected to it now, and that's really significant development.
Ruth Conniff, thank you very much. Stay on this story. We've been keeping up with this story through you. It's a story that really has just started. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Mike.
We perpetuate a culture of crime all the way from Wall Street right down to the main street in our hometowns. It's worse than it has been since FDR took control of the problem and said we can't count on industry taking care of the American labor. They probably have already engaged into some type of criminal cover-up, and the law prohibits the government from even doing anything about it.
Catch America's lawyer Mike Papantonio on YouTube at youtube.com/GoLeftTV.
Congress recently loosened a set of rules that help keep our roads a little safer. The new rules will make it easier for truckers to stay on the road for longer hours, which is going to put all of us at risk. Joining me now to talk about the dangers of truck accidents is Howard Nations. Howard, corporate greed it has no limits these days, and you've always got somebody willing to do their bidding. Susan Collins with this trucking legislation. I mean, how ugly is this, knowing how dangerous this whole trucking business is? Tell the viewers about what happened here.
Well, first of all, how dangerous is it? There are 4,000 deaths per year related to 18-wheelers, and driver fatigue is one of the leading factors. So in 1999, Congress instructed the Department of Transportation to address the issue of fatigue-related rules. This prompted 12 years, if you can believe this, it prompted 12 years of litigation trying to pass safety rules. In 2011, the safety advocates, the industry, and the FMCSA, which finalized the rule, they finally took effect on July 1st of 2013, only 14 years after Congress asked them to investigate it. In August, the Court of Appeals in D.C. upheld the rules and said, we hope this puts an end to this permanent warfare in this industry about safety rules. And then this month, Senator Collins moved to suspend those same rules that it took 14 years to get.
And then if you follow the money on Susan Collins, we know where it came from. It came from K Street. It came from, it came from the trucking industry. This is another one of those stories that tells you if we don't get money out of politics, virtually everything ugly that happens in this country, if you follow the money, it is a Susan Collins type that gets money from somebody to do the horrendous thing. Now, for David Dayen, the New Republic, did a great article on this, and I know you have an incredible insight because you are president of the Trucking Association, the litigation arm for attorneys throughout the country. How bad is the problem with overworked truckers killing innocent people?
Well, the problem is huge. It's now 4,000 per year that are killed. Most of them are killed in Florida and in Texas and California. The largest number, more than 10%, are killed in Texas. One of the major problems that we have is not just driver fatigue anymore. Now it's driver inattention because it's expanded. Drivers now are not only having problem with staying awake because they're driving so many hours, but now you also have cell phones, you have drivers texting, you have drivers popping pills, and they're doing everything they can to stay awake as long as they can and drive as many miles as they can because that's how they get paid.
And typically they're driving anywhere between 80 to 90 hours a week. I mean, just imagine you jumping into your car and driving 90 hours every single week, by the way, without a break. Now, you compare this to what they're doing in Europe. Europe, you are not a trucker is not allowed to drive more than 56 hours. And then after the 56 hours, it's mandatory that he have 14 hours downtime so he can recover. And they're still getting their freight all over Europe's expansive area. No, but nobody gets killed at the rate that we're killing innocent Americans with this trucking law. I mean, you see the distinction here, don't you?
I see the distinction, and the rule that Susan Collins just moved to suspend, if she got her way and suspended the rule, it would increase the number of hours that a trucker can work by 12 hours per week, and it would do away with the restart. It would suspend the restart rule that says that they have to have 34 hours after their work week. They have to have 34 hours before they can start their new work week. And this is what all the controversy is about, is how much time they have to have off. And amazingly, industry, the people who own those big 80,000-pound units, industry is the one that's fighting this. I mean, they're the owners of the vehicles that are involved in all these crashes, but they're the ones that are fighting this because it's more important to them to have the profit they make from carrying all that freight than it is to have safer roads, safer property damage themselves, safer property, and more importantly, their safety of their own drivers and the people that they're killing.
I don't know if it's a coincidence, but Walmart's name always pops up with these horrible trucking accidents. And one thing is Walmart. I know there's other companies, but as I look at the data here, I almost want to say if I see a Walmart truck pull off the road and let them go their way, I mean it's just accident after accident, and you have Walmart fighting this idea, fighting tooth and nail to make it safe. Not hell with their company. I'm talking about making it safe for the innocent driver out there. They were caught falsifying records, actually taking logbooks and falsifying records to get around the Department of Transportation that says you can drive 14 hours. You can have a driver up for 14 hours with only 11 hours driving, and then they have to take a 10-hour break. Well, they started falsifying that, and we started this barrage of crashes.
Well, let me give you my background on this, Mike. I've been handling trucking cases for 48 years. I have been, in that time, I have inspected many a cab of the trucks where we go to the accident scene. We've looked at the driving logs. The driving logs are falsified as a matter of course. People customarily carry 2 sets of logs. They carry one set of logbooks that they give to the when they have to stop for the inspections. They keep another set of their real logbooks. And so falsifying logbooks is a very, very routine, normal thing. But the other thing is that they are customarily now have cell phones and texting. We always get their cell phone records. When there's a tragedy involving an 18-wheeler driver, we get their cell phone records, and we find that they were calling, they were texting when the accident occurred. This has actually happened. They don't keep their logbooks up to date. As they come up to the inspection stations, one of the biggest tragedies I ever handled was right here in Houston, where a driver coming up to the station had gotten the message that they were checking logbooks ahead, so he was filling out his logbook as he was driving at 65 miles an hour, didn't see the traffic slow down in front of him, and killed 2 people, hit them.
And where we see this is the truckers. Average truckers making about $35,000 a year. It's not like they're raking in the dough. The people raking in the dough are the corporations that force them to do that. They have things where these truckers aren't even paid for taking the time to load and unload the truck. They don't get paid for that. They're strictly paid by the mile, and you have these corporations that are trying to hold them up mile by mile, day after day. For example, if a trucker has to make a trip from A to B, it's kind of as the crow flies, not as if you have to take a detour or anything like that. So don't you see the corporation very much the problem here?
Yes, the corporation, and we always look to the corporations in looking for liability, because we find that the corporations take huge measures to force these drivers to get on the roads and stay on the roads longer and to make deliveries faster. They set deadlines. You have a lot of the commerce today is like Amazon and people who are promising deadlines. They're giving shorter and shorter deadlines. And the result of that is that you have 33,000 truck wrecks a year. Imagine that, 33,000 truck wrecks a year with 4,000 deaths.
And where it comes to large trucks, that's even bigger than that. It's 300,000 large truck crashes per year. That's in other words, the number is staggering. I mean, David Dan's report talks about here in 2012 there were 330,000 truck accidents that year, and he devoted it to the very same things you're talking about. Howard Nations, thank you for joining me, okay?
My pleasure, Mike.
America still hasn't recovered from the damage left by the presidency of George W. Bush, but already there's another Bush who's dying to be president, and that's Jeb. Joining me now to tell us why this could be an even bigger disaster than W's time in office is newspaper publisher Rick Outzen. Rick, the conflict between the GOP, mildly crazy GOP, and then the frenzy crazy GOP seems to be at a full tilt right now. On one side, on the frenzy GOP, as they describe it, you got Ted Cruz. You've got all the usual suspects out there coming to jump on board. Looks like we might have another Sarah Palin run. Looks like you're going to have the same book of crazies. Then on the other side, the establishment Republicans say, "Oh no, we've got 2 mildly crazy people. We only have Chris Christie and we've got Jeb Bush." And so those are the people the U.S. Chamber of Commerce want to put because they're only mildly crazy, and they are part of what they call the establishment GOP. This fight's tearing the party apart, isn't it?
Oh, it is. And Eric Cantor's loss in the Republican primary just touched them even harder than they thought, because Jeb Bush stands for immigration reform. He stands for Common Core education reform. And that doesn't play well inside the Republican Party with the rank and file. The U.S. Chamber may want to push a pro-business candidate, but Bush is going to have trouble connecting with those that actually vote in the primaries.
Well, first of all, you talk about Bush. We hear about Bush more in Florida because he was the governor. If you talk about Bush anywhere else, Jeb Bush anywhere else, they're not that enamored with Jeb Bush. As a matter of fact, Ted Cruz is considerably ahead of Jeb Bush where it comes to all the straw polling and that. But they've got Jeb making speeches all over the country. They've got him in South Carolina. They've got him in Iowa. They've got him just all over the country getting ready for the run. But isn't one of the issues here, now you followed Jeb Bush, you followed him through the Independent for years, isn't part of the problem that in Florida the story was never told, the PNAC story was never told, the Shearson Lehman story was never told, the savings and loan story was never told, and he's going to see a different kind of approach to Jeb Bush when he gets out there for a national election, don't you think?
Well, in Florida, he dominated politics, Mike, from 1999 to 2007. And the PNAC story is an interesting story because it's not really even known outside of Florida as much. You know, that was a project for a new American century. It was the one that had Donald Rumsfeld was part of it. Dick Cheney was a part of it. It was a pro-military, get ready to invade Iraq initiative that suddenly disappeared in 2006. But it was very, very much in building a strong army, being one that would be more proactive around the government, not be afraid to take over countries or to lead regime changes.
Yeah, what it really was is about imperialism. I mean, if you took a look at their documents, by the way, you said it's no longer around. What happened when Iraq started failing, when you had Bush talking about what a glorious war was going to be, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, when everything started falling apart, the PNAC organization disappeared. In other words, you went from all of these employees, all of these active members, to where at the end in 2006 you'd make a call and there'd be an answering service with no employees. Because what was happening was the media was asking the question, isn't this a guy, isn't Jeb Bush talking about the need for expansive military action all over the globe, even not for safety purposes, but for imperialism, to build and take? That it's very clear that that's what PNAC was about. That was hardly even discussed anywhere about Jeb Bush. It's going to be discussed this time, though, isn't it?
I think it will be, because we're coming out of the longest war in this nation's history. We're having veterans who are dealing with all sorts of issues over multiple tenure, 10 years over there. They've had to deal with a whole lot of issues, and the war is going to be very much a part of the election. The results of that war will be very much a part of the election in 2016, and Bush will not hold up well with that.
Well, they tried to close the PNAC story down by saying they did away with the site, they did away with the organization, they tried to hide the employees, and they did that because people started taking a look at their charter, and it was Jeb Bush. Make no mistake about it. It was Jeb Bush saying we need to expand our war efforts, not just in Iraq, but in Iran, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in anywhere in the world that we might want to flex our muscle and take oil and take natural resources. It was all about pure, I mean, there's no other way to describe it other than textbook imperialism. So you have Chris Christie and you have Jeb Bush as kind of the establishment candidates. Now you have Chris Christie burning down, don't you?
Well, we have Bridgegate, and we find out that he was a political thug, or is a political thug, and how he operates anyone who stands against him. And that kind of thuggery doesn't play well on a national scale. Now, he's trying to convince the Republican faithful that that's behind him, that everything's been settled, and he's going to all the big money and telling them he's got this under control. Mike, you and I both know it's nowhere near.
Oh, no, it's just started. As a matter of fact, almost every week there's a new aide coming back saying, you know what, let me tell you how badly Chris Christie lied. It wasn't just about the bridge issue, lied about funding. The ugliest story is the Hurricane Sandy relief, where he told parts of the state, if you don't support me, you've lost your home, you've lost God knows what, your businesses, you've lost everything, but I'm not going to give you any money. He'd say this to the leadership, I'm not going to give you any money unless you support me. I mean, we're talking about people that lost everything. That story has barely been told, and basically the way they're looking at that story is from a standpoint of just extortion, isn't it?
Right, it is. Well, New Jersey's not that big of a state, and the mayors are coming forward because they're getting touched by their constituents, asking why haven't we dealt with all these infrastructure issues that they're still battling? Why are these businesses having trouble coming back from that hurricane? And they're not afraid to tell the story, and they're telling it to the Department of Justice. They're telling it to the news media. It'll be a crescendo that it will keep growing over the next couple of months.
Rick Outzen, thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you, Mike.
The Koch brothers recently wrapped up their annual Big Money Summit where they met with corporate leaders, lawmakers, and other billionaire conservatives. Their plan is to buy what's left of our democracy, and I have Laura Windsor from Undercurrent here to tell us what happened at this year's retreat. Lauren, it looks like the Koch brothers got their gaggle of billionaires together again to try to figure out how they can deconstruct democracy. This is an important meeting. I was so glad to see you reporting on it. It took place in Dana Point, California. Tell me what happened with this meeting and why you think it's important, why we should all think it's important.
Well, I think that anytime you have a large group of elites gathering in secret to strategize political policy, the lack of transparency is the very antithesis of democracy. So it's a threat. It's a threat to the freedoms of every American citizen.
Well, what they were meeting about were things that we know we already have problems with. They were meeting to try to put an end to Obama's health care. They were meeting to try to figure out how do we privatize education. They were meeting to find out how they can make climate change disappear as an issue in front of the American people. And these are people, about 300 of them, all of them billionaires? I mean, what are the numbers here?
Well, according to one of the sources that I spoke with at the conference, according to this source, there would be 300 individuals in attendance worth at least $1 billion each.
Okay.
I know from source documents that there were 400 people slated to attend. In terms of the 300 billion, it's likely an exaggeration. According to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, or actually I believe it's Forbes, sorry. According to Forbes, there's 492 billionaires in the United States, for perspective. While I think that's an exaggeration, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration as to their fundraising goals. According to that same source, the fundraising goals were $500 million to take control of the Senate in the midterms, and then another $500 million to make sure that Hillary Clinton is never president.
Well, we know at this point there are no rules in fundraising now. I mean, I don't know how else you could characterize it, Lauren. There simply are no rules. It was bad enough before Citizens United. It was bad enough before McCutcheon. And then now we understand, we see what Scott Walker's been up to with raising money up in Wisconsin. We understand that there are no rules to begin with. So if there's an influx, the kind of money you're talking about is a total. We're talking about $1 billion kind of money here. And what is it that required so much security at this meeting? I mean, it looked like the security was White House caliber security.
Well, you have a lot of high net worth individuals meeting with politicians. A lot of the security was for the politicians themselves. So you had Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, Cory Gardner. There were a few others.
All the usual suspects, it sounds to me like it. And they're there.
Well, most of them were all running in this midterm election cycle. So with the exception of Rubio, who was a 2016 contender. So all of them had a reason to come, seek an audience with these donors.
What were some of the topics they covered? One that caught my interest was this idea of changing the narrative on energy, trying to make it sound like we don't need to worry about climate change. We need to worry about whether we can be energy dependent. Talk about that and some of the other issues that they talked about. I mean, they're right out front on issues that we're all concerned about, aren't they?
Well, I can't speak as to the contents of those conversations. Those were smaller group discussions that obviously weren't open to the public. But from the draft agenda and the documents obtained, the panelists on the energy changing the narrative discussion were all Koch messaging operatives, not scientists. So this, clearly isn't an issue for them that they want to debate on the merits of science, but one that they would rather debate in the political messaging framework. So a la Frank Luntz.
Yeah, and so one thing they want to do is they wanted to leverage the science at universities. And, of course, we know the story where we have the Koch brothers already trying to buy Florida State University there in Tallahassee, where they've actually purchased the business department. They make a decision on who gets hired, what gets taught. But that was part of the discussion, too, apparently, was how do you leverage universities and have them spewing our kind of neocon nut talk? Wasn't that part of what was going on out there?
Well, that was part of a larger discussion, a strategic discussion that was divided up into 4 different parts. So there was a part 1, part 2, part 3, and then the 4th part, if you will, was a speech from Senator Mitch McConnell about free speech, defending the First Amendment. So the first one of that had been featuring Michael Lomax, who's the president of the United Negro College Fund. And so that was about changing the national conversation. Well,
now they just gave him $25 million. It's amazing to me when you really have to figure what these conservatives have to do with NAACP other than to buying this guy, having him show up, and then talk about their policy. Has this been going on a regular basis? They've been having these meetings on a regular basis, Lauren?
They have for several years now, yes.
Yeah, and every time we have the meetings, hold on, because your pocketbook is at risk, is the way I see it. Lauren Windsor, thank you for joining me, okay? Great work as usual, Nation Magazine. And this is an article everybody ought to read. It's called Inside the Koch Brothers' Secret Billionaire Summit. Thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringofireradio.com or at Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.